Christopher Hitchens, who talked you into doing an autobiography?
I think it may well have been the person who wrote my obituary by accident. In the catalogue of the National Portrait Gallery in London a couple of years ago, there was an exhibit about a group of people, friends of mine and of Martin Amos's, a sort of set, if you like. And in the catalogue copy, it referred to the late Christopher Hitchens. And they were terribly upset and said, "Don't worry, we'll recall them all, we'll pulp the whole thing." And I said, no, I want several copies of that, because nothing focuses the mind like reading about yourself in the past tense. And it immediately dissolved any objection I had when I was asked to do a memoir, which is, well, isn't it too early? I think, well, I certainly can't leave it till it's too late. So there was that. And then I told myself, excuse me, I talked myself into it a bit, because I didn't much mind being 40 or 50, I barely noticed it, but 60 hit me harder than I thought it would. And I found I was looking backwards quite a lot, brooding on things. So I thought this is probably the right moment to do it.
Why Hitch-22?
Well, I end up having described a lot of commitments I've had in my life and a lot of ideological battles I've taken part in, with a general polemic against certainty and against purity, against consistency, if you like. I'm no longer a member of any party or any ideological grouping, but I am associated with a group of skeptics who are sure of one thing, which is that nothing's for sure, and you're absolutely certain about the uncertainty principle. And so my Hitch-22 is that my commitment is entirely to doubt. So that's the idea. And then there was a game. I have a lot of word games in the book, some of them very puerile indeed, schoolboy humor, but getting better as time goes on. And one of them is a game invented by Salman Rushdie, where you have to think of a book title that didn't quite make it. For Whom the Bell Rings, for example, or Mr. Zhivago, or Good Expectations was another one, A Farewell to Weapons, Portrait of a Woman, and one that he contributed actually was Hitch-22, and I thought, yes, I think I might borrow that.
Death is a theme in your book.
Yes.
Why?
Well, because I begin with my own obituary, accidental obituary, then because it's not an autobiography exactly, but I thought that everyone, if they're doing a memoir, they have to do one chapter each about their parents. And death, I'm afraid, is a big subject there, because my mother took her own life in very tragic circumstances, very dramatic, tragic circumstances that I described. And my father was in the war business. He was a lifelong naval officer who'd had a very tough war. And I was brought up entirely on stories of chiefly British valor at sea, and on land and in the air. I mean, I can't remember how old I was until I realized that all television, all books, and all films were not about the Second World War. I thought they were.
You titled the chapter about your mother, Yvonne.
Yes, I called Yvonne, well, because it was her name, and because that's what I used to call her. She liked it, and because it's a nice name. And it's the way, when I think about it, I don't think mummy, I think, or mama, or I think Yvonne. We were very close, and I also used to think, because we came from a slightly drab part of English society, sort of lower middle class, with aspirations, naval and military, and my mother was a sort of failed milliner. She kept trying to open dress shops that never quite made it. And so the sort of the wives of my father's brother officers were called things like Ethel or Marjorie or Nancy or names like that. And I always thought when I was little that Yvonne had a touch of class to it. It was a little bit more cosmopolitan perhaps, a bit more stylish, a bit more soignée. And she was that in my life. I describe her as the gin in the Campari and the cream in the coffee. She was cheerful and humorous, and once said to me that the really only unforgivable sin was to be boring, which has haunted me all my life. Fear of bores, fear of becoming a bore or being boring. Terror, stark terror about tedium.
Do you have that fear?
Oh, yes. Yes, it's with me always. I mean, I think it's probably the most devastating word that one can use against somebody or risk having used against yourself, yes. Don't be boring. Mustn't be boring.
This book is full of names, bold-faced names, as I say. I'm just going to throw some out and have you respond. Martin Amos.
Yes.
Who is he? What's his relationship to you?
Well, Martin is, as I'm sure a lot of your audience will know, is a brilliant novelist, both of humor and of gravity. I mean, he's written novels about the Holocaust and about the Gulag Archipelago, but he's also written, I think, his best humorous one, best known one, is called Money, which is a study of sort of Anglo-American degeneracy and at the cusp of the 1980s, in which I appear once or twice, fairly heavily disguised. And he's my best friend and has been since we were in our 20s. And a chapter of the book is basically a sort of love letter to Martin. And I'd say in that chapter that the question I'm trying to answer is, phrase it like this: can you have a heterosexual relationship with another guy? I don't know whether you can or not, but I decided to give it the sort of old college try. And I described the influence he had on my writing, the way in which we used to have very long, languorous, very tender, very intense discussions about women, the inexhaustible subject. And I show how you can make lead into gold, as I describe a visit we both made to a terrible massage parlor brothel outfit in New York, which he had to go to because his character in Money, John Self, had to go and expose himself to this. So it was field work, and it was the most intensely sordid and horrible and depressing, shameful, really, morning of my life, I think. And for him, too, absolutely ghastly. You can read it in Money. I even give the page reference. And I thought, when I read that section, John Self's fiasco in the massage parlor, I thought, well, that whole morning of squalor and misery, it's now been sort of totally redeemed. It's become literature. It's an almost Proustian moment. You can get wasted, lost time back and feel it wasn't squandered after all. So, I don't know if I'm giving you a hint, but I mean, he's been a great source of enthusiasm and risk and so on in my life.
James Fenton, you dedicate the book to him.
James changed my life when I met him at Oxford in the late 60s, where we were exact contemporaries. He is, I think, easily the finest poet writing in English, at least of his generation now. And probably best known to your audience for the poems he wrote from Indochina. It's a surprising thing when you think about it. There's almost no poetry generated by the Vietnam War, or if there isn't a poem everybody knows, as there have been poems from other wars. The best is written by James. I quote some of it. And he, as well as Martin and a few others, taught me that there was more to writing and more to journalism than polemic. You know, I used to think that the test of a good article was how well I'd argued the case, how well I'd sort of laid out the arguments for the left, how bad I could make the right wing look, how I'd marshaled the arguments. It was all very didactic. And though James, like me, was very much to the left, to him it mattered much more how the article was written, making every word count, using irony and understatement and humor. And we actually even wrote a couple of articles together, the only time I've ever done a joint byline with anybody. And he was immensely influential on me in that way. I think prevented me perhaps from becoming boring, to revert to the death trap subject.
Peter Sedgwick.
Yes. Peter Sedgwick would be less well known to your audience, but he was a Marxist intellectual of a very rarefied kind. In other words, he was one of those people who was of the left against the left, very, very anti-Stalinist, very much against some of the cult figures of the 60s, like Herbert Marcuse and R.D. Laing, who were being much bandied about. They were conjuring names when I was beginning to cut my teeth. He thought the 60s were probably a bit of a false promise. The counterculture didn't interest him very much.